Particularly in terms of East Africa, where is the UK looking to invest in infrastructure at the moment?
Well, look, East Africa is incredibly interesting, and what I've seen over the last couple of years is a really strong inflow of interest from UK business, both for exporting and investment into East Africa. And you know, they're really attracted by this regionalisation approach. And so it's not just Kenya, though Kenya is really interesting, but Ethiopia, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda as well, and starting to look really closely at Sudan as well. You know,
and Ethiopia has been we have had great reports coming out there how the economy is changing fast. What opportunities is the UK seeing there?
So we've had got a new Prime Minister in Ethiopia, and who's really very pro-business and looking to improve the business environment for investors and exporters, and a big population as well. Big country, big population. That sort of stuff really attracts UK businesses. And of course, you look over the last few years at the rates of economic growth that we've seen in Ethiopia, and it all adds up to actually a really exciting market. We're doing a range of things. In particular, we're looking at manufacturing and supporting the growth of the manufacturing base in Ethiopia. And that's important because we're seeing sort of flows of manufacturing moving all across the world. And for Ethiopia, that's really important because we're looking at job creation and building that sort of inclusive growth. And I think that's a really key part of the UK investment and exporting focus.
And also, there's a lot of competition for business in Africa these days. China, as you know, has made tremendous moves on the continent. How is the United Kingdom trying to keep some skin in the game, as they say?
Well, the UK is the second largest investor in Africa after the US. And I think many people see this strong push by China and believe that China is now the largest investor, and they're not yet. So when my Prime Minister came to Africa a few weeks ago, she announced the ambition for the UK to be the largest G7 investor across the continent. So shifting up from that second place and really taking the lead. And so that's a big focus for us now, and really keen to make sure that we kind of follow through on that investment, but also not be afraid to work with others. And I think there's a really interesting complementarity that we can see between the Chinese offer and the UK offer. And so sometimes that's around finance, sometimes it's around sort of project management and design and delivery, sometimes it's around standards and regulations. And so we think actually that there's a huge opportunity not just for UK companies to be working together as a UK consortium, but actually across national boundaries and to bring in Chinese capability alongside UK expertise.
And two factors which surely must be influencing British policy at the moment. First one, this incredible trade war that's causing havoc around the world and particularly across Africa. How do you think the UK is going to address that in its policies?
Well, the UK has said very clearly that we are open and fair traders, and we think that we are global champions in that. We know that open economies trade more, and that creates more jobs and economic growth, and that's fundamentally what we're about. So as we look to leave the European Union in the coming months, we're really focused on making sure that the existing free trade agreements that we have, particularly in Africa, are transitioned smoothly to provide continuity and consistency for exporters, investors, traders, and then to look at actually what happens next. So we know that there are more things that we can do outside of free trade agreements, frankly, to just improve the flow of people, trade, of exports, goods, services across national borders. And so, how do we facilitate that movement across national boundaries?
Well, the second one I was going to mention, you just said it yourself, Brexit. There's a lot of feeling in this continent at the moment that Britain is perhaps being a lot more friendly to trading partners this year than maybe year before last, when before they voted to leave Europe. Is that true?
Well, I think we've always had a very close relationship in Africa, but I think inevitably UK companies have looked to other markets perhaps a little bit more than Africa in recent years. But what we have seen since the decision to leave the European Union is a really strong surge of interest amongst the UK investment community and the business community more broadly to really look at Africa again and really understand the opportunities here. And of course, that goes hand in hand with the growth of opportunities that we're seeing. And I think it really is extraordinary when you look at how fast growing some of these economies in Africa really are and the focus that governments are increasingly putting on making these economies more attractive to investors.
And just last but not least, you've been talking to a lot of people this morning, foreign investors at this conference. What's the feeling you're getting? I mean, there's a lot of optimism we're seeing in the corridors on the surface, but deep down, what do you think the story is?
I think there's a huge amount of excitement about the investment opportunities in Africa. And, in fact, anywhere across the continent, there are enormous opportunities in pretty much any sector you can think of. And I think what we're seeing now is a shift in focus, a real desire to work with African governments to improve regulatory environments, to tackle some of these challenges that put investors off, and frankly, to tackle some of the fear perceptions. Because I think one of the things that we often see for foreign investors is that perception of how to invest in Africa and the opportunities is quite different to the reality. So we'll be doing quite a lot of work over the coming months to really try to address that and make sure that investors really understand what it's actually like to invest in Africa.
Well, they say, what is it, capital is coward. It'll go where there's the least risk, but what are you going to do about this? I mean, African nations have been struggling for decades to try to improve their image overseas in terms of investors and reassure people. Well, what can the British government do?
So I think there are a number of things that we've been doing over recent years. So we've been working in a practical way with some African governments to really tackle some of the sort of, as mentioned earlier, the ease of moving goods and services across national borders. So how do we reduce the time it takes to move products across boundaries and therefore reduce the cost of doing business? How do we help African countries build capital markets? And so we've been doing quite a lot of work across the continent to do that. We've been connecting into the London Stock Exchange Group in the UK and really helping to mobilise the capital that sits in the City of London and build those relationships. All of this sort of tackles sort of perceptions and builds the relationships that fundamentally lead to doing investment and business in Africa.